Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here at the latest in a series of webinars hosted between the ICFJ and the Tao Center at Columbia Journalism School. The theme of our series is covering COVID and the pandemic. It's linked in particular to a study that the Tao Center and ICFJ are conducting into how COVID is changing journalism. Hopefully this morning, we've talked a lot so far in the series about the pressures and the privations that journalism is suffering at the moment. Hopefully this morning we can also show you some of the innovations and, if you like, the power of journalism through storytelling. And I'm really, really thrilled to be joined by three of the world's absolutely sort of best editors to talk to about this. They will tell you a little bit more about their organizations and what they're doing. But just very quickly, we're joined by Marc Lacy, the national editor at the New York Times. Welcome, Marc. I love your press notice on your bookshelves. Robin Kwong, who's the director of newsroom innovation at the Wall Street Journal, or at least has started that post in December 2019, who previously was 12 years at the Financial Times, where in a very similar role, he led innovation, particularly around storytelling and story formats. And Marta Gleich. Welcome, Marta, from Brazil. Marta is the journalism director for digital and radio at the RBS group in Brazil. And of course, my colleague, my partner in crime and research, Dr. Julie Posetti, who is the ICFJ's global director of research. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to kick off, if that's okay, with Marc and the New York Times. The Times has been in the headlines for all sorts of reasons in the past week. One of the good reasons it's been in the news recently is for some of the very, I think, powerful work it's been doing on reporting COVID, which after all is the hometown story, Marc. You know, so people forget, we think about the New York Times as being a global brand, but it's also, you know, we're in the city, which is the epicenter of the epicenter. And one of the things I think that was most striking was your edition in Memorial Day weekend, where you ran both through the paper, a very, very powerful front page of 1,000 of the people who had died, and one-line descriptions or obituaries, just so that we remember who those people are, and had a translation of that online as well. Just wondered, I know you have some sort of visuals to show us, because I was going to say, could you tell us a bit more about how the Times has been sort of approaching this and some of those innovative packages that you've put together?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really good to be here. This is a story, and I'm going to show you a couple of slides here. This is a story that's very much, in a sense, a data story, an epidemiological story. And the New York Times has been collecting data on cases, on deaths, on testing, from the very beginning all over the world. But it's also really a human story. It affects everybody all around the world. And I think this project that you're talking about was meant to sort of merge the two of those, to really acknowledge that the numbers that we're talking about have grown so large that they're actually hard to fathom. And so we were approaching this 100,000 death anniversary. And it was, there was discussion about how can we at the New York Times, how can we show what that means and make people really feel that number? And I think what this project was meant to do is sort of humanize the whole thing. And so, can you see, Emily, the front page? Is that showing there?
It's not at the moment. If you were, yeah, there we go. Oh, perfect. Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So basically, this image was featured in a pointer piece about the New York Times front page. And we ran a front page, and you can see it here off to the right.
Yeah,
That was all names and a little bit of bio information. There was not a single picture. There were no other articles. This went on for 4 pages inside, and it was 1,000 names, 1% of the 100,000 people who had died. The outpouring from this was just dramatic. And off to the left, you can see the digital display that was just as powerful. And it's, in some sense, this showed the powers both of digital media and the powers of print media in one organization. And we could argue all day over which was more powerful. And I think they were equally powerful. But I guess the point here was, how do we make people feel what 100,000 deaths mean? And all of these are actual people whose lives ended, were shortened by this pandemic. And it was a simple process. We basically called 268 local newspapers all across America to find people who had died of coronavirus. And we were trying for some representation as to where they were from and who they were. And the reaction from this was incredibly strong. This was one of the most read New York Times pieces, not just this year, but in history. And so it really struck people. It was, it was shared all over the world. There, news organizations were talking about our front page. When was the last time we did something like that? And it really, the comments were just flowing in like crazy. And then, as you can see here, people used our front page to make all sorts of political statements and cartoons and other things. But for us, this was data, which we have a massive data collection effort that's driving all of our journalism, yet we're trying to bring the data to life, and there is no reason that stories on something as dramatic as a pandemic ever have to be dull. And I think that was the purpose behind this.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marc, for sharing that with us. And just before we move on, I just want to ask, just so people know, I'm sure that they would have guessed this anyway, but the New York Times, your newsroom was one of the first to close down. I think certainly you closed the New York Times newsroom before many businesses were closed in New York. So all of this has had to be, everybody is working completely remotely, is that right?
Right. So it really has taken some getting used to. All of the collaborative discussions that you really need to do this sort of thing have to be arranged in conversations like this. So I'm talking to people in little boxes, and I'm not actually seeing people face to face. We're a huge organization, and in order to do the sort of journalism we're discussing today, you have to work across departments. And so we had to, for this project, work together with graphics, we have digital design, with our print hub, with so many different departments, and there were just so many meetings, and it's just a lot tougher to do, but it's just required to do this.
Can I ask, Marc, sorry, before we move on, another question. How does that sort of need to communicate virtually over a project that has such a creative outcome, how do you think that has affected the way you might communicate into the future? In other words, have you learned things through this process of digital collaboration, trying to bring meaning to those conversations that you'll take forward into, IRL life when hopefully this is over?
Yeah, I think we're talking about that now. The New York Times building is still closed. I am talking to you from a guest bedroom that may appear to be a polished office, but it is just a guest bedroom. We're talking now about how the New York Times will be different when we do go back. The Times will be closed through Labor Day, but we don't expect all of next year to be returning to the same way we were working before. And I think there's just something about no matter whether you're in the office or whether you're home or whether you're doing other things, like the ability now to convene people, and part of it is just who do we need in this meeting? And I think we should be asking that a whole lot more, like over inviting, and so what brains can we bring together to brainstorm? We're just doing a whole lot more. And I think this situation we all find ourselves in, I'm sitting alone here, and the only way I can get anything done is by inviting people into a discussion. It's no longer by turning to the person next to me, turning to the regular people. It's by convening. And I think great journalism comes from convening a lot of smart people, and so I think we may emerge from this better at that because it has to be so intentional in a situation like this.
Fascinating. Marta, can we come to you? You're in Brazil, and the New York Times, in fact, published a story earlier this week describing Brazil as being in coronavirus freefall, which has huge implications, of course, not just for the population, but for your news organization with its many outputs from radio and I think television, but through to newspapers. You're responsible for the papers and the radio output from your news organization. So let's take it from the perspective of the humanity that we've heard described and we've seen visualized for us by the New York Times. I mean, radio is, for example, a very human medium. A lot of people will speak and share highly emotional experiences via radio. But when you're in the middle of a pandemic where social distancing has an impact, how are you trying to respond creatively to that challenge, for example? And don't need to limit your response to radio, but you can reflect broadly.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. Our main option in RBS, the company where I work, is during this pandemic is constructive journalism, also called solution journalism. Before the pandemic, we were talking inside the company what we can do to face losses of credibility and relevance. And we decided to adopt constructive journalism in our practices. The kind of the criticism we have in the press, that we have a negative bias or shows only one side when approaching the news, or even that we are disconnected from real life. When the pandemic arrived, all this talk about constructive journalism has been accelerated a lot because we want to bring some hope to discuss a lot how we can solve health or economic problems related to this crisis. So what do? We quickly trained 100% of our newsrooms in television, radio station, newspapers, digital, and now solution journalism is becoming like a part of our culture. I'd like to mention an email from the public I received some minutes ago. A lawyer wrote this, and I'm going to read, translating.
Thank you.
I want to congratulate you and the entire team of journalists for the twist that was given in order to accentuate the good news that is most frequently being broadcast, analyzed, and commented. It motivates us, lift the mood, transmit us, and inject a feeling better, less pressure, more light, and fundamentally generates a feeling of confidence in our work and in our life. So constructive journalism have been very important, a very important practice when reporting on coronavirus.
So just to summarize, I mean, solutions journalism, which has been rebranded to an extent as constructive journalism, really focuses on analyzing potential solutions to a problem, like putting the emphasis on possibilities rather than concentrating only on the very serious, deadly consequences of a pandemic, for example. But how do you approach that in a country like Brazil, when, not unlike some other countries, the leader, the president, is an active spreader of disinformation? So you have this double challenge of needing to ensure that your audience has accurate and fair information, and that you're countering lies, let me put the words out there, given the situation you find yourself in, and disinformation and misinformation. But then so how do you do both that work of being accountable to your audience in terms of investigative journalism and accountability journalism, and do the work that you describe of emphasizing potential solutions? What does that look like and sound like?
Yeah. In Brazil, we are fighting several wars at the same time. It's the fight against the coronavirus, a very, very strong radicalization. We are receiving much more attacks on the press, and also a great confusion on the part of the government and the president, which launched erratic strategies and messages in relation to social isolation, for example. The government changed the Minister of Health twice during this pandemic. And now the government even omits information about numbers of the disease. You know that the media launched this week an initiative to supply the numbers that the government does not provide. So a partnership between some of the country's leading newspapers and websites collects data such as number of infected and number of deaths, and disseminates it daily. It's a huge challenge to do journalism in Brazil today. And the newsroom needs to deal with this coverage, all this coverage, political and at the same time. We deal with this, Julie, by specializing reporters in numbers, in health, on specific topics related to this disease. And how do we do this? To train the journalists, we use this kind of virtual meetings. So twice a week, we have short conferences, and this includes many issues, but also training to avoid this misinformation. I think, and that's what I'm trying to do, that we will leave the pandemic more qualified as a team and as journalists when then we enter in this pandemic. So this is what we are trying to do.
That's great, Marta. I'm going to come back to you, I think, on some of those what we should be doing, or how we're going to kind of leave the pandemic in a way, and what we all think about the sort of shape of newsroom. So I just want to come to Robin. Hi, Robin. It's great to see you. I'm first of all going to ask, where are you?
I'm still in London. So one of the challenges and some of the new ways of working that we've had to deal with in the course of the coronavirus pandemic is I am managing my team fully remote, 5 hours ahead of where they are. That has actually been really good practice for me from December to about February, because from March, everybody else is in the same boat as me and having to work remotely.
So, as I said, you've actually been in post as head of newsroom innovation there at the journal since December, but you had a long track record at the Financial Times over more than a decade of really experimenting, probably almost more than anybody else in international newsrooms, with different types of formats and how you could demonstrate things through games or theatrical performance. I know we've spoken about these things in the past. Just going back to sort of Marc's point about, this is a data story. I think that's how a lot of journalists have reacted to it. The Wall Street Journal, is a business brand, but it has a huge global audience. What have been the things that you've been thinking about in terms of how do we tell this story differently? And what are the challenges that you're encountering, apart from having to get up extremely early to speak to your staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with Marc. I think this is a huge data story. And actually, my former employer, the FT, has done a really great job during this time of assembling international data and presenting that as well. So my role at the Wall Street Journal is to lead a newsroom innovation team of developers and designers. And we basically build prototypes of new features, new formats, new tools. So in some sense, we work really closely with our data and graphics team, but we're sort of one step removed from figuring out directly how to use data and data visualization to tell the coronavirus story. And what our team has been working on is actually along 3 areas. And I'm just going to share my screen and show a couple of examples. And it's really around how we use technology, how we use sort of the various products of the Wall Street Journal, the website, the app, to first of all sort of make information, make reported facts, make crucial information more accessible and more sort of widely disseminated. This page itself has a couple of examples of things we've worked on. So very early on in March, when we made the decision to turn some of our stories free to read as free resources, there was the question of, well, the journal does this so rarely. How are people going to know? And how are people going to find what are the free resources? So our team helped very quickly build this pretty simple navigation bar at the top that we then work with our publishing desk to keep updated and populated, and work for product teams to make continuous improvements to it. So, it now loads much faster. The design is much cleaner from the first version that we popped up. But we were sort of the team that was able to just go in very quickly, put a first version up, and just be very nimble and inject some momentum into it. This is a Q&A piece, one of the examples of sort of story formats that have been in existence for some time and have been used, but have really sort of come to the fore during the coronavirus pandemic. People have a lot of questions about all aspects of what is happening, about testing, about our states opening up, what stores were closing down, and what's opening up again, and sort of fairly simply, you have a bunch of questions and you answer them with reporting. But what we did was to create this new interactive format, because we thought that if you're a reader and you come to one of these articles, what you want to know is the question that I have in my head going to be answered in this article? And in the traditional format where it's just static and everything is opened up, it's quite hard to skim through and find your question. So it's a sort of minor sort of format change, but we think it's one that just sort of like gets people to information a bit quicker, helps them sort of navigate our site and look at what is actually out there. And then further on, a second aspect of what we're really doing is to try to use this as an opportunity to turn journalism into a bit more of a two-way conversation, to make it less about sort of us doing reporting, finding things out and broadcasting it back out to everybody, but to really sort of engage, sort of a hackney termed, with the audience and try to figure out what they need and what they want us to find out for them, and to do that. So the infrastructure behind the ability to spin up a feedback form, a call out form like this, and to handle all of the responses that come in, and then to share that in a safe and secure and privacy sort of protected way within the newsroom for reporters who can then use it to go to reporting. That is some of the sort of invisible work that our team works on as well. And I think one of the things that I've been really heartened by is just the sheer amount of reader call outs and sort of sheer sort of work the reporters and editors have put in to reach out to readers in the past couple of months. This is sort of in collaboration with our video team, but we also created these live Q&A events to sort of bring conversations and interviews to life, so that not only is there a reporter on a virtual stage, in this case, usually over a Zoom call, interviewing someone, but subscribers and readers can ask questions and have the questions sort of asked and answered during that event. And then the last thing I want to point out is some of the work that I've been especially excited by, and that work that we've been doing, is around thinking about like whose voices get heard during this pandemic, and whose stories get told, and whose perspectives sort of get seen. I mean, particularly within mainstream media like the Wall Street Journal. And this is a project that we worked really closely with our young audiences team, and it's to sort of they did hundreds of interviews. They did a fantastic job doing hundreds of interviews with young people all over the country about their experiences during this pandemic. And I think we want to talk a little bit about reporting challenges later on, but one of the reporting challenges is it's hard to get out there and talk to people. And sometimes, especially younger people, they're like, well, why don't I just like shoot something on my iPhone and send it over to you? This is going to sound a little bit inside, sort of technical insider baseball-y, but most news organizations' video content management systems just aren't really set up to handle like user submitted little video.
Oh, we Robin, lost you for a moment, Robin.
Robin, we've lost you for a moment. I'm going to hope that you come back. This is London Wi-Fi, everybody. But that's a good. I'll wait for Robin. Oh, you re-established your connection, Robin. We lost your screen.
Am I back?
You're back. You're back. Yes. Sorry, you were just.
Sorry about that.
You were just. I think the content management system gods got to you there, because you were just
never badmouth. Yes, never badmouth your
CMS. Never badmouth the CMS. But you were making a point, which I was very familiar with this from my days of running the Guardian's digital outfit, which is, as you were saying, the CMS actually of most publishing sites doesn't work in the same way that social platforms do. So you can't it's not interoperable with the kinds of storytelling sort of techniques and tools. So what did you do about that?
So yeah, I was just sort of saying that like it sounds quite simplistic on the surface, but just sort of figuring out a way that we could handle, I think on that page that I showed, we had around 60 videos. So you could handle like a largish amount of videos all coming in terms of different orientations, different formats, getting it through the system and just getting it published. Should be a simple thing, but actually isn't. But I'm really glad that we were able to do that work, because it means that we could then go out to, when we go out and interview and talk to all of these young people, say, hey, you want to just sort of tell us something on video, you want to talk into the video and tell us something about your experience, you can do that, send it to us, and we'll actually be able to do something with it.
Can I ask you, Robin, just because Marc was saying that, the memorial exercise from the New York Times, not surprisingly, generated the biggest sort of engagement and traffic that the news organization's ever seen. And I know that, your former colleagues at the Financial Times, those charts that John Byrne Murdoch has been doing, who would know that a chart would be the most popular thing that you would ever publish, but there you are. What have been the things that that you've seen most engagement with at the Journal? Is it the daily updates? Is it different, kind of, what do people come to you looking for?
I think It's probably the case for sort of quite a lot of our publications in that the traffic surge is quite across the board, actually, that there has just been an across the board sort of surge in interest in viewership and page views for our stories. But I think for the journal specifically, people are interested in what's going to happen to the economy. And so sort of when we do stories about which states are opening up and to what extent and when and where and how, that's been really popular. Another is a series of columns we did called Making It Work, where we just talked to people in different professions about, what is it like being a truck driver during the pandemic, running a bakery in the pandemic, trying to manage a factory floor during the pandemic. I think those stories about how people engage with their work, how people go about their work, what they're sort of, and then related to that, the small business loans, sort of just explaining what that is, who's eligible, can you apply for it? I think some of those have been some of our really sort of engaging and popular stories.
And there's a question I was going to ask you, but I'm actually going to ask the whole panel, and I'll start with you. Just looking at your navigation bar there, one of the things which actually I was talking to my students about this, which is how do you, we don't often talk much in newsrooms about how important information design is, and suddenly in the pandemic, you have a daily story which deeply affects people personally, which actually they have to change their behavior in accordance to what's going on outside their homes. And as a news organization, the sort of the idea of refreshing things constantly, etc. I'm just wondering how your organizations thought about, or maybe did you approach information design differently? Did you sort of think about what are the things that actually we just wouldn't do at the moment, but which might work, which will work for this situation?
I think that is really one of the big central challenges. And I think some of the things that we have done so far and that I showed just now go a little bit of a way towards addressing that. So just having, I think that what do we know about testing story was, I don't remember the exact date, but probably first published 2 months ago, and then sort of kept updated since, and just like making sure it has that spot quite prominently on the homepage. Some of those things do help. I quite liked seeing some of the examples come out from different news organizations in the last couple of days of an article that just says, what do we actually know? So it's been, if we count from the start of lockdown, 3+ months, we have actually learned a bunch of things. There are still some questions that we don't know, and just sort of rounding that up and publishing that is I thought a really good idea. But it still sort of exists within the rubric of being an article. And I think sort of we all know that sort of the article sort of half-life is, you get the vast bulk of your traffic within the first 48 hours of publishing. And the real challenge is sort of like how to extend that and sort of keep that up afterwards. Don't really have sort of really, really great answers to it, in part because I think some of the assumptions around what we publish and how it's meant to be consumed is just really baked into the whole infrastructure of the site, the whole information design. So unfortunately, slightly sort of unsatisfactory answer, I'm afraid.
No, well, it's an honest answer, which is very satisfactory. Marc, as well, I'll sort of come to you next on this, which is, that's a great point that Robin makes about the half-life of articles, and also about people needing to perhaps refresh what they think they know about the current situation, and as a news editor, or as a, kind of it's almost sort of counter-cultural to think we have to keep going back a little bit and re-explaining.
Right, it's a great question. I mean, we've been talking about forever viewing the news more from the reader's perspective and less from a group of smart editors in a conference room deciding what readers should know. And I think this story, the New York Times, and I think all of the publications that I read have really embraced this idea much more. So we did something early on which wasn't my idea and probably wouldn't have been my idea, which was, wait, there's a whole lot of numbers here, and people are going to want to know these numbers. and the federal government isn't collecting, much like in Brazil, the CDC does not have particularly good numbers. Maybe the New York Times should step in. So we started collecting numbers, and we now have close to 40 people doing nothing but collecting numbers. And so we believe the very best spot to go to find out if you're living in a particular county in Iowa or Nevada or California or New York, and you want to know what's happening in your home county, you want to know what's happening in your state, you want to know the trends, you want to know the big picture, the smaller picture, that the New York Times is a good place to go. And our case, we call it our case counter, and it's full of maps and interpretation, is the single most viewed thing that we've produced during all of this. It's updated round the clock. And again, a team of people that I initially wondered, wait, you know, a lot of them are from my desk. Should they be doing this? It has led to so many great other pieces of journalism, including that 100,000 project. It's giving, we're seeing trends ahead of time, and we've started something else. You know, explainers are definitely just second nature for us. What questions are people asking that we should provide answers to? But we're doing something else that I think, this is a traditional article, but it's from a reader perspective. We're calling it, in political coverage, it is very common for the political reporter to do a state of the race story. It's like, so you've been reading all this disparate information, all these polls, there's all this stuff going on. Give me what's the state of what's going on? And Dean Baquet, our executive editor, was at one of these times where you're sort of hearing, wait, cases are going up here, cases are going down here, they're stable there, there's reopening. Like, how should I wrap my mind around what's going on? And he said, give it to me, can you guys produce a state of the virus story? And so we've now done 4 of them. We have another one coming out, and it's really like, at this moment in time, what should you know to have an accurate view of what's going on? Because what's really both, it's just a reality in science epidemiology, is that of course there are a lot of truths, but there are exceptions to everything. And so we can say that social distancing is an effective way of reducing transmission. We can say that reopening is likely to increase the number of cases. And we can also look at the evidence and find states that reopened where the number of cases are going down. We can find other states where they reopened and the cases are going up, where they're stable. There's all this jumble of information, and how do we process that for the reader? And so that point that I just mentioned, we're going to be explaining in the next day or so. I won't give away the mystery, but it's really trying to cut through all these numbers and help people in a conversation. So is it better or worse? What should I think? Should I be terrified? Should I be optimistic? And so that's another thing we're doing. But it really is what's exciting. This is an awful, awful moment in our world history. I mean, think about what we're enduring right now. But for journalism, there is an exciting aspect of it. We've been talking about being more innovative. We've been talking about sort of the importance of different story forms and digital. Everybody should be digital. And here's a story where all of those trainings that all of these people have gone through for years now, it feels as though we've been doing it for this story. Like, here's the story where you can use everything you've been taught in every training. And it's really a great test for did those trainings make sense? And I think clearly they did. Clearly there's something there that breaking out of the traditional long article form is wise, necessary, prudent, just good journalism. And here we have just evidence of it every day.
It's such an interesting observation, that, because it's reminded me, my time in the newsroom, the only story that came close to this was really 9/11. And for us at The Guardian, it totally transformed everything that we did from there. If I had to put a pin in a moment, it was that day, because it's when you discover all sorts of things about your audience, which you've theorized, but which you haven't actually had to design into your journalism. And it's a sort of, it feels like this story, as you say, is exactly the same. And so, Marta, on that point, you were talking about solutions journalism and the positivity. Are there things how are you communicating that with formats? Are there things now that you're doing differently, or do you do things on a daily basis that you perhaps wouldn't have thought about doing before?
Yeah, every week we meet with the editors to evaluate this practice of constructive journalism. And I agree with Marc that we have to be very close to our audiences. And for example, I'm going to give you 2 examples. People want to know many things about this huge, with this information that comes every day. And it's a challenge to process this every day. So one thing that we did is special editions for the newspaper, but for the website in PDF on specific topics for subscribers only. They are like guides to access when you need, when the audience need. Some examples, how elderly people should protect themselves during this pandemic, or how to be well with children at home. That's a big problem for our public, to everyone. How to help people who are in need of food, for example, to be solidarity, or how to control the budget to face this crisis. This is a problem to all of our public, and so on. So these contents had an excellent acceptance by the subscribers. And it was a way for the newspapers to be together, to show solidarity for our audience in this difficult time. So we try to organize our coverage in 3 pillars. Number 1 is information, the news of the day. What do you have to know that it's happening today? The second one is service. For example, for people to protect themselves, for example, and this kind of things. And third one, very important, is inspiration. Giving hope to people and showing ways to go out from this crisis. So we take care of this balance in every edition of the newspaper. For example, in the front page of the website, or in a TV program, based on these 3 pillars: information, service, and inspiration. So I think that we are very close to our public doing this. And on our news radio station, we created a second channel just by streaming to answer questions from the audience. And we use WhatsApp to engage the public in our coverage. So they can send questions and we answer in this second channel. We put some forms like Robin showed at the end of the stories in the newspaper and in the website to receive contributions from users. So that's what we are doing.
That's really great, Marta. I just wanted to dig a bit deeper into some of the challenges that you are likely to be facing that might actually provide insights for those of us in more developed Western contexts in terms of dealing with the human toll and consequences of this crisis. Because even though this is a very big data story, and we've heard some excellent examples of how important it is to allow the data to help drive responses and the humanity that can be brought alive with data, as the New York Times example in particular shows, and the little vignettes that Robin talked about of everyday life. But you're in an environment where, you know, as is the case in many other cities, of course, there is extreme poverty and pockets of, you know, serious disadvantage that you also have to focus on in terms of how you're serving your audience. In other words, arguably, your audience is more diverse than the elite audiences that perhaps the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal serves. So what can you share with us about how you try to tell the stories of those people who are not, you know, even able to afford necessarily a meal in the context of this pandemic? Just talk to us about the way you approach those stories and to try and build that audience.
Okay, so we have different media. Television that is very popular, a newspaper that is very popular, and quality newspaper, and the radio station. So we reach all the public, and we have to separate and to be very specific in each media. So for example, in our popular newspaper, we make a front page to people to learn how to use a mask, for example, the whole front page. Because we think at this moment, this is our best thing to do to help people to survive. It's not a question of, oh no, doing journalism. No, to survive is a very important question. I like to say to our team that you cannot imagine that in a simple sentence, you could be saving one life. And that's what we have to think every day. How can we, as journalists, can save lives in this pandemic? Because in our country here, with lots of confusions with the government and everything, and politics, that's what we have to do. Service. Teach people how to survive in this pandemic. So we are trying to reach different audience. Each media has to tell the stories in different languages, but the main thing is helping people to survive and go on.
It's fascinating, isn't it, the way that, you know, we have to concentrate on developing creative solutions, and this is the time to put all of those lessons into place with all of the incredible technology we have. But really, sometimes being innovative does come back down to fundamentals of mission and service and saving a life through your journalism. Sorry,
no, I was just going to say that actually sort of just squaring the circle there and coming to some of the people that we have in the Q&A, and thanks for joining us. We have people from everywhere. We have people from Cameroon, Nigeria, Europe, etc. And I'm just going to wrap up a few of the questions that have come in that I think directly relate to this, which is, several people have asked about, what are the best strategies, both for persuading audiences, as you were saying, Marta, to do the right thing at the right time. And secondly, about this ever-present issue of trust and how we can be trusted providers of news when you often have governments or even official health organizations who perhaps are saying things where the facts change, or where they're politically compromised. It's less of a story format question, but I think it comes to this point that you were making, Marta, about describing how to wear a mask, just giving people good information. I just wondered from each of you, maybe kind of, sort of Robin, obviously, sort of starting with you again, often we've talked about the success of news organizations measured in, financial sustainability, etc. Is there a kind of an eye to how can we make sure that our information is the right information delivered at the right time, and do you see that having an impact on how audiences perceive news?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it has a huge impact, and I think one of the challenges for a lot of legacy media organizations, news organizations, is when you are trying to reach out to new audiences, they don't come with that automatic sort of institutional knowledge of why things are in a certain place, or the whole sort of brand history of why this is trusted. So I think that is critically important, and I think there are two aspects that do make a difference. So one of them, which I really believe in, is just to be in dialogue, and instead of just trying to broadcast, to sort of turn it into a two-way conversation as much as possible. And part of my team's role is providing the right tools and channels and platforms to allow reporters and editors to do that. The other thing that I think is really important is, even when we do things that seem less traditionally news-driven news-driven journalism, the more service-oriented journalism that we do, just the rigor of reporting really actually matters. So I'm going to go back to that slightly sort of simplistic example of our Q&A answers, right? So there's a difference between answering a question just by saying, well, I've Googled it I've Googled 3 articles on the web and I've summarized it into this answer for you, versus picking up the phone and calling actual doctors and experts and researchers and putting the rigor into that sort of, putting the reporting rigor into that form of journalistic output as well. I think those two things are just really fundamental and important.
Yes, I was going to say same thing to Marc, really, which is, again, the Times is, I think, very close to its audience, both for good and bad. I suspect in the newsroom that you really feel the heat when people disagree with what you're doing. But you have there's a big and very diverse audience within New York City, many of whom are not necessarily Times readers, etc., all of whom are very, very vulnerable to this disease. So again, just in terms of sort of, the kind of the idea of trust and reaching perhaps some of those communities, that how does the Times see its role in that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Emily. I mean, here's one thing. You have to start with the science and the data and understand the pandemic. And I think that's where we're starting. We have to become experts in what's going on. So when we discovered that there were racial disparities in who is getting coronavirus, dramatic racial disparities, and who is dying from coronavirus, we had led the paper with this. We disclosed this. This changed the conversation, and I think the coronavirus, the health implications of the coronavirus, cannot be separated from the economic despair that the U.S. is in and the world is in right now. And so you have people who are with more people than ever who are without jobs, who are sick or at risk of being sick. You have inequality in our healthcare system. All of that is like a huge, huge story that requires an organization, and this is sort of what we view as our mission. And I loved Marta's sort of saving lives mission. That was powerful. I believe our mission is to cut through all of the misinformation that is out there. And it is out there in Brazil, I'm sure, but it is in the United States, and it's in every country around the world. Politicians do not necessarily have an interest in people knowing the inconvenient truths of the pandemic, and they want to project a message of we're on top of this, our strategy is the right strategy, we have this under control, and our mission is to really root out the truth. And so, President Trump has offered suggestions on what sort of treatments might be effective in dealing with the coronavirus. I mean,
light, bleach,
all manner of products. And our job really in a case like that is, what is the truth here? And if we don't have credibility and we aren't reporting the truth, it's dangerous. It's dangerous in so many different ways. And so it is, I agree with both the other panelists. I mean, this is life or death. The news media, the public at large has low faith and belief in the news media. All sorts of surveys have shown. And this is a pretty good story for us to be recovering some of that by just being straight, just sticking to what is truthful here, and being a great source of this, of cutting through all the misinformation.
There is a question about that. Sorry, Julie. I just want to pick up on that though, Marc, and just ask everybody, because you're both. So we have outlets that are serving audiences in, real epicenters. One of the things that Cuomo, that Governor Andrew Cuomo said, and I think Marta, I think this applies in Brazil. He said about a month ago, where were the bugles? Where were the people who should have been calling out the danger of this disease earlier? And he actually named the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and others. Now, Marta, you're in a slightly different position because Bolsonaro was not saying, where the, but this is a question really to reflect on how, we're often told don't overplay things, don't sensationalize them. But just reflecting on that beginning of the virus, do you, Cuomo obviously trying to shift blame, but at the same time, do you think that perhaps we were too conservative as press in terms of not being more sensational, not sort of actually kind of pressing harder at the beginning of the pandemic? Marta, I wondered how you would cope with that in Brazil, where I'm sure your journalists saw this coming and you had official outlets saying, don't worry, I'm out, in the street shaking people's hands.
I think everybody could not predict the size of this pandemic. And we all, as press, as government, as any institution, make mistakes in the beginning. So I think that as local press, because we are local here in the south of Brazil, we try to see the world and show what's happening outside. But in the beginning, I think that local media could be more closed to this big virus. So I think everybody made mistakes in this in the beginning. But I think that we react and very, very quickly. And I think we, as journalists, are the main institution to mobilize the society and quickly say and realize that this is a huge, huge problem and you have to pay attention. So at the same time that we didn't react properly in the beginning, we quickly make a response and answer to this big question: how is the size of this problem, and what do you have to do, and what is happening, and what the science say, and everything. So that's my evaluation. And I think that, again, to respond to this is doing better journalism, to diversify the sources much more, to ensure that opinion are based on facts, to separate politics from health issues, and intensify science and technical approaches in media, and to listen to what the public is saying, what the public wants to know, and discuss a lot about these issues inside the newsrooms, because the reality is changing in a very, very fast way, and we have to follow this and respond to our public.
Can I follow up on that, Marta? There's a few questions coming through from the people who are participating today. I realize we're not talking here about the Black Lives Matter movement, but people asking about the conflation of these stories in a way. The fact that we have now to report on coronavirus in the context of mass demonstrations and how we try and navigate that, because as Marc and others have pointed out, you know, one of the big stories to emerge from this crisis is the disproportionate way it impacts on people of color and people from other disadvantaged communities. And that goes to issues about ethics that I'd like to try and, in the time we have available, touch on. Ethics and trust, which we've already referred to. And Marc, it would be remiss of me not to come back to you on that point earlier about the need to, you know, robustly represent the facts when it comes to building trust with our audience. And this is all happening in the context of a great reckoning within journalism internationally around false balance and, you know, and challenges around the perceived inability of traditional Western models of journalism to understand the distinction between impartiality on the one hand and you know, humane journalism on the other, that they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. And this long preamble is to say that there was a controversy, of course, with involving the New York Times, where there was it appeared an application of a false balance test to one of Donald Trump's claims about treating coronavirus. And in the end, if I'm recalling correctly, there was a decision made to at least apologize for a tweet and to reframe a story in regard to that as a way of trying to deal with the audience craving for the role of journalism as a sort of, you know, as a it's judicious in a way. You know, we assess information and so on. So can you reflect on that, just in terms of the ethics that are really tumultuous at the moment as we grapple with these converging issues?
There's a lot there, and I can probably talk all afternoon on all of these topics. I mean, you're very right that the pandemic, the unrest on the streets, the George Floyd story, and George Floyd's name is now known by every single journalist in this chat and all around the world, and there's movement all over the world. They're now one and the same, and there are people who are on the streets advocating for police reform who are invoking the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on Black people as one of the things that is getting them out on the street. So it's like one big complicated story altogether. And oftentimes we think of stories in separate buckets, but that isn't the way the world works. And the rage on the street is tied up so much with everything that's going on. So that's sort of one. I think you're right that all of this, let me give you one other aspect of that's going on in the world that is part of this. We are an extremely divided United States of America. Politically, we see the world based on where you are in the political spectrum very differently. We don't even agree on basic facts in this country. And I think that that same thing can be said across the world. So here you have a story that at its core, the coronavirus story, is about science and facts, yet you don't have an agreement on that. And the media has been pulled into one camp, and the media is disparaged by the president as fake, and everybody is looking at every tweet for a possible sense that it is betraying some underlying bias. And sometimes it is just a poorly written tweet by someone who wrote a bad tweet, and there is no deep, sinister message behind it other than someone wrote a tweet, and tweets aren't edited as carefully as other things. So, but all of this is tied together. And here we are, journalists, trying to navigate all of this. And all I could say is it's not easy, and there are no rules. I can provide no sound bite that is going to make it easier, but we're all sort of covering the news and looking around at all of the reactions, the way what we're reporting is being interpreted in the world at the same time. And it's just tough. It's a tough time to be a journalist. You're scrutinized, it's really tough. But it's also, I like to focus on the other part of it. It is like, we are needed more now than ever. And in the United States, a number of news organizations have gone out of business during all of this. The ad market is collapsing. We haven't mentioned that. So anybody who's in this chat who has a job should feel like it's a blessing, should feel lucky. There are a lot of journalists who are out of work. So it's like all of that together, we are needed more than ever, and we need to emerge from this story with our reputations intact, and we have to work double time to not do stupid things that hurt our reputation even more. So it's like a real moment of truth, I would argue, for the media.
And not do stupid things is the
not do stupid
bite.
things. Exactly, is exactly right. I just wanted to very quickly, because I know we promised to let you guys get. I was going to say lunch, but in probably Robin's case, not lunch.
And mine, it's almost 1 o'clock for Robin and I.
So one thing I wanted to. There's a question from Steph from South Africa. Thanks, Steph. Just saying that we're a really small newsroom in a regional newspaper, and we absolutely can't do everything well. What should we be focusing on most? So perhaps, Marta, coming to you first, and then Robin and Marc.
Sorry, could you please repeat?
Sorry, yes. This is a question from somebody who works at a very small newspaper in South Africa, and says, if we can't do everything, what should our newsroom focus on? What is the one thing that we should do really well?
Yeah, I think service is the main thing. Especially in countries in development, like Brazil. We have to save lives. So our mission is to help people to survive. in both ways, in terms of health and in terms of economy. How to go out from this crisis with small business and everything. Help people to deal with the problems right now. If I have to choose just one thing, I would do this thing in terms of service.
Great. Marc, what's your advice?
I think that that's really so smart. I guess one thing is you should be focusing on one thing, and you shouldn't be trying to do everything, and you shouldn't sort of say the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or anybody else is doing all these things and I should try to sort of do as many as I can. It's like, really, what is the essential need that you can fill in South Africa? What's most needed by your readers? And that's essentially what Marta is saying, service. What do people need? And then provide it. And forget about all the other things that a news organization can do. Do that really, really well.
Robin.
Cool. If I can, I just wanted to go quickly back to what you were saying a couple minutes earlier, Emily, about what Cuomo raised, which is I have a slightly different perspective on that because I'm from Hong Kong and my parents are from Hong Kong, and I'm sitting here in London, and Italy happened before the virus moved on to the States. So I was reading stories about Wuhan in both the Journal and the New York Times at the end of last year. Stories about sort of how the virus was spreading throughout Asia and then into Italy. Great stories about Bergamo early in the year. So I kind of disagree a little bit about sort of the premise that there wasn't enough sort of reporting on the fact that this was coming, whether it's actually for the UK or for the US. But going back to, I don't have a whole lot to add to that question about the small newsroom and what you should do beyond what Marta and Marc said. Absolutely agree with what both of them have raised. And just to sort of add a little bit to that is start by listening. I think if you start from there, you can't really go wrong.
I think that's something that's come up from everybody here. I've been obsessed in that slightly sort of self-absorbed way about how people have been talking in the last couple of years about real innovation in newsrooms, and they've been mentioning newsletters and podcasting, which we were doing in 2005. And actually, I've begun to think, well, often there are things which are not necessarily innovations, but which perhaps we have forgotten about. And I think I wouldn't call it crowdsourcing or UGC, but I think that the work that lots of people did over the past decades in, and perhaps abandoned a little bit about actually connecting on a personal level on their own platforms with their audiences is definitely something that I'm seeing much more of in journalism at the moment, which is absolutely goes to the heart of what all of you've been saying, which is listen, connect with your audiences, give them access points to what you do, let them kind of suggest things to you and hear from them. So that's I think that's great.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Emily. I mean, I think that this really resonates with me. I spent 18 months or 2 years researching journalism innovation and wrote a report called "Is it time to abandon the shiny things or step away from the shiny things when it comes to innovation?" This was for the Reuters Institute, and I think a lot of what particularly Marta and now Robin and Marc have said about pulling back to core mission-based innovations is especially important in a local context. But also, I mean, I started my career as a journalist in local public broadcasting, and you don't get closer to your audience than you do within a public broadcasting environment. So there's lots that we can take away from those experiences. And in some ways, local news organizations have an advantage because they are traditionally physically closer to their organization. So just some encouragement there for many people in our community right now who are from small local or regional outlets. And I think on that note, Emily, we might wind it up because you guys have enormous tasks ahead of you in terms of reporting. Certainly in the US, the day is not even half over. And we certainly do want to thank you very much, Marta and Marc, and also sorry, I'm having, Robin, a mental blank on your name. I'm looking at you and I was about to call you something completely different, which would have been really, really unfortunate. So,
I also,
Robin, Marc and Marta.
Yes, I'm also kind of going to suggest, though people could always commit to things which are months and months away, but I would love to revisit some of these conversations with you guys, because one of the things we're going to do with our research is find out how frontline journalists are experiencing the issues that you're talking about, but also how it changes over the course of the next year as we see all sorts of kind of economic pressures, but also hopefully things that we take away from this pandemic changing what we do in the newsroom for good, as well as the downside. But I just want to thank all of you. That was an absolutely terrific conversation. I copied Marc on when he said I could talk about this all afternoon. I really could, but I'm not going to keep you from your lunch. So thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks very much. Anyone who wants to take the survey who hasn't, we've had, I think I'm technically correct in saying thousands of responses now. But if you haven't taken the survey, please do. There is a link to it in the chat. It's there so that we can capture losses in newsrooms, but also experiences of journalists and your thoughts as well. So it's really important that we capture this moment for the field and learn how we can rebuild, as they say, better. So thanks very much indeed, everyone.
Just before you say goodbye, though, just before you do that, one important thing. So the survey is currently in English. This is a global survey from the Journalism and the Pandemic Project. The link, as Emily says, is in the chat for the English version. Marta, very relevant to your community. Today we launched the Portuguese version of this survey. We have the survey coming out during the course of the week, also in French and Spanish and Russian, and I'm going to forget a language, and Arabic and Chinese in Mandarin. So please share it within your communities, guys. And we have another Journalism and the Pandemic webinar next week focused on media freedom and journalism safety threats, which also came up during this conversation. We will be speaking to Courtney Radge from CPJ, Zoe Titus from the Namibia Media Trust, and Mexican journalism safety expert Javier Garza. So I'd very much invite you to come back next Tuesday at 1100 Eastern for that conversation. And I must tell you that if you are not already in the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, which now has over 3,500 members, which is a great core of our study as well, that community, please join. We're seeing a lot of wonderful collaboration happening there. And that's an opportunity, whether you're from small town South Africa or from the New York Times, for you to connect and share your experiences. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye.